Have you ever stopped to think about how a company like Netflix streams movies to millions of people all at once? Or how your bank operates 24/7 all over the world, probably without owning a single server in its main office? Well, the magic behind all that is the cloud, and one of the biggest players in that world is Microsoft Azure. Today, we're going to break it all down by thinking of it as maybe the ultimate digital Lego set. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll take a quick look back at the world before the cloud, just so we can appreciate why it's such a massive deal. Then we'll explore Azure's huge global foundation. After that, we dive into the fun stuff, the core tools that do the work, and how Azure stores and connects all your data. And to wrap it all up, we'll see how all these pieces click together to build a real, working application.
All right, let's just imagine for a second that we're back in the early 2000s. If you wanted to launch a website, you couldn't just, spin something up online. No way. You had to physically build a data center. That meant buying these massive, super expensive server racks, figuring out how to keep them from overheating, hiring a whole team just to maintain them, and then doing it all over again in a few years. It was slow, it was costly, and honestly, it was a total headache.
And this slide right here really gets to the heart of the financial shift. The old way was all about what's called capital expenditure, or CapEx. You had to spend a huge amount of money up front on all that hardware before you even knew if your idea would take off. The cloud, though, it flips that on its head. It's all about operational expenditure, or OpEx. You're not buying, you're basically renting. You only pay for what you use when you use it. And that one change completely rewrote the rules for everyone, from tiny startups to giant corporations. Okay, so we've seen the problem with the old way. Now, let's talk about the solution. If we're building with our digital Legos, the very first thing we need is that big green base plate, right? The thing you build everything on top of. Well, for Azure, that base plate is its absolutely massive worldwide network of data centers. So the biggest piece of this foundation is something called a region. It's pretty simple, really. It's just a specific geographical area like East US or West Europe. When you go to build an application, your very first decision is choosing which region it's going to live in. And usually, you'll pick the one that's physically closest to your users because that means things will run as fast as possible for them. Now, here is where it gets really clever. A region isn't just one giant building. It's actually made up of multiple, totally separate data centers called availability zones, or AZs. Each one of these AZs is completely independent. It has its own power, its own cooling, its own networking, everything. And this is so important because it means if one of those buildings has a problem, say a power outage, your application doesn't go down. It just keeps running from another AZ in that same region without skipping a beat. That is the secret sauce to building apps that can survive just about anything. All right, our base plate is down. It's time for the actual Lego bricks. In the Azure world, these are the compute services. You can think of these as the engines. They're the pieces that actually do the work, that run your code. Let's take a look at the main types you'll be working with. This table breaks down your main options, and it really all comes down to how much control you want versus how much you want Azure to handle for you. On one end, you have Azure Virtual Machines. This is what we call infrastructure as a service. You get a full virtual computer, and you control everything, the operating system, the software, all of it. It's great for older apps. Move up a level, and you get Azure App Service, which is platform as a service. Here, you just upload your application code, and Azure handles all the server stuff underneath. It's perfect for web apps. Then you've got Azure Functions, which is serverless. You literally just provide a tiny snippet of code that only runs when it's needed. And finally, for the really complex modern stuff, there's Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, which is all about managing thousands of little application containers at massive scale.
Okay, so we've got our engines to run the code. But an app is pretty useless without data, or a secure way to connect all the different parts, right? This is where you bring in the more specialized Lego pieces for things like storage and networking.
Azure gives you a few main tools for storing your data, and each one is for a different kind of job. So if you're building something like Instagram and need to store millions of photos and videos, you'd use blob storage. It's built for these huge amounts of unstructured files. But if you just need a simple traditional hard drive for one of your virtual machines, that's what disk storage is for. And if you need a shared folder that lots of different computers can all access at the same time, kind of like a network drive in an office, you'd use Azure Files. And one of the coolest things about blob storage is how it helps you save a ton of money with its tiering system. You can actually tell Azure how often you expect to need certain files. The stuff you need all the time, that stays in the hot tier for instant access. Data you only touch, say once a month, can be moved to the cool tier, which costs less. And for data you have to keep for years for legal reasons but almost never look at, you can stick it in the super cheap archive tier and get some huge savings.
Okay, let's talk about security for a minute. You wouldn't just leave all your Lego creations out in the open for anyone to mess with, would you? Of course not. And you definitely don't want your application's components just exposed to the entire internet. That is where the Azure Virtual Network, or VNet, comes in. It lets you build your own private, isolated section right inside the Azure cloud. It is literally like building a digital fence around your entire setup.
And if the VNet is the fence, the network security groups, or NSGs, are the security guards at the gate. An NSG is basically a simple but powerful firewall. You create a list of rules that control exactly what kind of traffic is allowed in and what's allowed out. For example, you can make a rule that says, only allow web traffic in from the internet, and another one that says, let my web server talk to my database but block it from talking to anything else. It gives you this incredibly fine-grained control over security. All right, we've gathered all our pieces. We've got our base plate, our main building blocks, and all of our specialized connectors. We get the foundation, the compute, the storage, and the networking. Now for the best part, let's follow a blueprint and actually see how these pieces all come together to build a real application. This blueprint here shows exactly how a modern app on Azure works. Let's just follow the request. Okay, step 1. A user's request comes in and hits a gateway. From there, step 2, that traffic is sent over to our web app, which is running on that app service we talked about earlier. Next, for step 3, the app needs to load some images, so it grabs them from blob storage. In step 4, it needs to pull user data from an Azure SQL database. When that user logs in, step 5 shows that's all handled securely by Entra ID. And finally, step 6, this entire process is being watched by Azure Monitor to make sure everything is running smoothly. You can see how every single piece we discussed has its own specific, crucial job to do. So when you zoom out and look at the big picture, you start to see that Azure isn't just a random box of services. It's a really deeply integrated platform that's built for serious enterprise-level work. It's designed to connect with the systems companies already have, especially if they're in the Microsoft world. And it puts a huge emphasis on things like security, compliance, and automation above everything else. So at the end of the day, that's what Azure really is. It's an incredibly powerful and flexible set of digital building blocks. It's a toolkit that gives you the power to build pretty much anything you can dream up, from a simple blog to a globe-spanning AI-powered application. Microsoft has provided all the pieces. The only question left is, what will you build?